Okay, first graders, last week we learned facts about George Washington and we wrote about George Washington in our paragraph. Today we are going to learn facts about Abraham Lincoln, who was another one of our presidents. Okay, and we are going to use the same format that we used last time. Okay, we are going to use those three columns with the main topic up at the top. Okay, so we're going to create it in our journals though. So let's look at that. Okay, so in your journal, we have an empty page and I am going to break this writing section into three columns. Okay, so I'm going to put a line right about there going all the way down and right about there going all the way down, so that I have 1, 2, 3 sections that are close to the same size. I could have put that line a little bit further over. Okay. And then our topic we're going to put up here is going to be Abraham Lincoln. Okay. And then underneath him, I'm going to put in parentheses he. Because when we write our sentences, remember, we don't have to say Abraham Lincoln every time to introduce another detail. We can use the word he to save space, save time, and still communicate the idea. Now, the first sentence you write, your introduction sentence, you will need to say Abraham Lincoln. Because if you just say, I know some facts about he, or which would be grammatically incorrect, but I know some facts about him, nobody would know who him is. Okay, so when we introduce our topic, we want to make sure we use the full name, Abraham Lincoln. But then when we share the details, we can just use he. Okay, so I am going to read you guys your Scholastic News. You can get it out and follow along. And I want you to be thinking, what stands out to you as interesting about Abraham Lincoln? Okay, so I'm going to move my journal out of the way. And this one is called All Aboard, Abe. Long ago, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He had to go to Washington, D.C. That is where presidents live. How did Abe get there? Look at the picture for a hint. Okay, how do you think Abraham Lincoln got to Washington, D.C.? He rode the train. That's right. Okay, as you read, think about how Abe's time was different from today. Okay, so very similar to when we were reading about George Washington, we are reading for information and clues about how times have changed. Okay, so we want to say things that are true about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, Abe's train trip. Abe took a train. Abe had a big trip to make. He was president now. He had to get to Washington, D.C. He could not take an airplane. He could not drive a car. This was long ago. There were no airplanes or cars back then. Most people rode on wagons pulled by horses. Trains were something new. They were much faster than a wagon. Abe took a train. Okay, so that could have given you some ideas of a detail you could write about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, we could say in the detail that Abraham Lincoln was our president. We could say that Abraham Lincoln had to get to Washington, D.C. to live, we could say that Abraham Lincoln rode a train to get to Washington, D.C. Okay, let's see what the next section talks about and if we can find more details about Abraham Lincoln. Abe met people. Abe's train, sorry, Abe's train stopped at many stations. People came to see him. Back then, there were no TVs or computers, so most people had not seen their new president. Abe loved to meet people. He stood at the back of the train. He talked to people and told them funny stories. One time, Abe was telling a story. Before he could finish, the train pulled away from the station. When the train got to the next station, Abe was surprised. He saw the same people. They had run from the last town. They wanted to hear the end of Abe's story. Okay, so in that section called Abe Met People, what are some details about Abraham Lincoln that you learned? Okay, some things that stood out to me was that Abe loved to meet people. I also liked the part that he told funny stories. Okay, so those are a couple of details that you could share about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so pick one of those and write it down in one of the sections on your graphic organizer. Okay, let's read the third section and see if we can get a third detail. Abe had some problems. Abe liked meeting people. He liked telling stories. But his trip was not all fun. The train traveled through rain and snow. Abe got a cold and lost his voice. And some people just didn't like Abe. In one town, a boy threw a snowball at him. Finally, Abe's train arrived in Washington, D.C. The trip had been 13 days long. Abe had loved seeing people. Now he had to get to work. And just for fun, this is Abe's real hat. It is in a museum in Washington, D.C. Okay, what were some details you learned about Abe in that section? It repeated that Abe liked meeting people. It repeated that he liked telling stories. So if you didn't already have one of those, you could put it down. But we also learned that some people didn't like Abe. And we learned that a boy threw a snowball at him while he was president. We also learned that his trip to Washington, D.C., the trip had been 13 days long. Okay, and we learned that Abe wore a stovepipe hat. That's what this hat is called. Okay, so which of those details stood out for you? Okay, let's make sure that we're putting them in our graphic organizer. Okay, so we have our topic, Abraham Lincoln, at the top, and then we have 1 detail, 2 details, 3 details that stood out to us from the story. Okay, what details did you choose? Make sure you've written them down. Let's take a look at the details that I chose. Okay, so I thought it was important to know that the reason we're talking about Abraham Lincoln and learning about him is that Abraham Lincoln was one of our presidents. And you can see I can use the topic and my notes, and it would make a whole sentence. Abraham Lincoln was one of our presidents. Okay. Another fact is he liked telling funny stories. Also, he took a train to get to Washington, D.C. Do you see how I was able to create the sentences that we would use in our paragraph from the notes I took? Okay, notice that again. So if I was doing our paragraph, I'd say, I know some facts about Abraham Lincoln. First, he was one of our presidents. Another fact is he liked telling funny stories. Also, he took a train to get to Washington, D.C. Those are some facts about Abraham Lincoln. Okay, now you don't need to have the same facts as me. You need to have the facts that stood out to you from the story. I would love to see different things from every person because we all have our own minds, we all have our own thinking, and there were going to be different things that you thought were the most important. So get your graphic organizer put together in your journal and share it with me. Remember, you can always look at the Scholastic News on your own as well if you want to go back and look at it some more and read through it some more. Okay? That will not only help you get more ideas of the details you could share, but also there's always fun activities mixed in. Have fun and happy learning.